this week with some of our worship team, and we're laying down some tracks for hopefully what will be a new album sung by people from Connections. We're pretty excited about it. A friend of mine came up from Cheyenne, and he's got a real studio. What I have is barely a project studio, but Adam brought some real microphones and real instruments and all the stuff that you would need for a legit studio. And the main piece, one of the main things that separates a real studio from a generic studio is a microphone like this. And Adam has a bunch of these, but this is a super high-end, meaning very expensive, condenser microphone. And what makes condenser microphones unique is that inside there's this condenser, it's a little capsule, and it has electricity flowing through it all the time. And when that electricity hits these two plates, they vibrate back and forth all the time. Even when no one's talking, they're just constantly moving. It's like they're actively listening, like they're just waiting for you to say something, and it affects those vibrations and it picks up our voices. But it's always going, it's always going, it's always going. Versus a generic microphone that we sing at during church or whatever, just kind of sits there and it's not really listening for you. You got to turn some things on to make some things happen, but this one's just always waiting to hear your voice. Well, I got to think, like, how can I be more like that towards God? How can I be constantly listening and constantly trying to hear God's voice all the time? There's a passage of scripture that I love. This is in Mark 4. If you haven't read it before, I recommend you spend some time in it. And Jesus is laying out to a group of people, he's telling a parable about some seeds that are tossed along a path. And certain seeds do certain things depending on the soil and the seed and different things. It wasn't uncommon for Jesus to do these parables, and nobody knew what they meant. And so afterwards, the disciples pulled him aside. They just said, "Well, Jesus, what did that mean? Like, what were you saying?" And he begins to explain step by step all these different seeds and different paths. And again, you can go read it. But at the end, he just says this. He says, "If any man has ears," he's talking about you and me, "if we have ears to hear, let him be listening, constantly listening, and let him perceive and comprehend and understand." In other words, we can't perceive what God is saying. We can't understand what God is saying if we don't first listen. We have to be listening and understanding. But then he gave them this warning. He said to them, "Be careful what you are hearing." In other words, be careful what you're listening to. He said, "The measure of thought and study you give to what you hear will be the measure of your virtue and knowledge." So what you're listening to will change who you are. So pay attention to what you're listening to. Well, my prayer for us is that we would be listening to God, and kind of like this microphone that can pick up even the tiniest sounds. That we would be hearing the smallest voice of God. Maybe God's been telling you something and you kind of just hear half of it. You just hear a part of what God's saying. Well, if we just be active in our listening and we're constantly trying to hear what he says, maybe you can hear exactly what he has for you. That's my prayer for us. Again, I'm hoping you're having a great week this Sunday. Please come hang out at Connections. We are coming to the close of our series on marriage called The Table for Two. And this week I'm going to be talking specifically to men about loving your wife. Paul says that we are to love our wives as Christ loved the church. And that is a big charge that he has given us. We're going to talk about some ways to do that. So 10:30 Sunday morning, I hope you'll come hang out with us. It's going to be a great time. We'll have the full band back this week, electric and drums, and it's going to be a great celebration. So hope to see you Sunday. God bless, and stay connected.